Clearly my plan of only working on farm trucks didn't last very long. On today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at this 2005 CL55 AMG. This is actually the CL55 that I converted from a hydraulic suspension to a coil-over suspension. A lot of people in the comments were saying that I ruined this car. Well, the owner tends to disagree, and so do I. Yes, it does handle a little differently, but it hasn't lost its sports car grand touring feel. It's definitely still a comfortable way to get around. He's put about 10,000 miles on it, and he's very happy with it. He likes the way it drives and handles. He also doesn't mind not having to pay the bills to fix that ABC system constantly. So you can see on the dash here, 114,000 miles. Interior's still looking in good condition. Definitely looks like it's garage kept. Paint has a few marks on it, but nothing too major. Definitely some brake dust on the front wheels. You can also see some grooves in those front rotors. So one of the things we'll be doing is pulling off the wheels, taking a few measurements from those rotors, finding out if they need to be replaced or not. Same thing on the rear, some grooves cut into the rotors. We'll definitely measure those as well. Taking a look around the rest of the car. Like I said, paint's in pretty good condition. It's definitely been used. It looks like it has 120,000 miles on it. So the main reason why the owner brought this one in here today is because the alternator failed on him while he was driving. He noticed a few of the electronics had stopped working before the vehicle eventually came to a complete stop, but it's definitely still having some funny issues. So one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to start it up, see if all the interior functions are working, see what kind of messages we got on the dash. Oh, what's going on here? Yeah, it definitely looks like a few of these wires are pinched, kinked, not routed correctly. But we'll definitely need to go through, take care of that. Alright, so it looks like just a check engine light for now. Next, we'll take a look at the alternator output, see what it's actually charging the battery to. So you can see that it drops down to about 12 volts after revving it, full fielding that alternator. So we've definitely got an alternator that's on its way out. It's not outputting what it should. It should be between 13.8 and 14.2 with the vehicle running. So this is definitely a sign of a bad alternator. Oh, and there we go. So after running for a little bit, we've already got the battery charge visit workshop fault code showing up. So that's another sign that your alternator has failed when you get the red battery message. So we're gonna go ahead and hook up the scan tool to this car, check all of the systems. My guess is there's gonna be a lot of under voltage fault codes. Let's find out. So yes, even out here, I am using an Altel Maxi Diag Elite. I really like this scan tool. It does just about everything that I need, and it's reasonably priced. So first off, we're gonna start by go ahead and we're gonna scan the whole vehicle. So this one is smart enough to read the VIN. So we're gonna run through, we're gonna check all the control units. Anytime you're running a short test on these vehicles, it's always a good idea to maintain the battery voltage. This is a Midtronics PowerCharge PSC 700S. All this is doing is maintaining that battery at about 13.4 volts while the quick test is running. That way I don't drain the battery while it sits here. It's also a good idea to have a charger or maintainer on the vehicle anytime you're doing any sort of diagnostic where the key is in the on position for an extended period of time. It just helps to prevent draining the battery too quickly, causing any sort of unnecessary damage. Alright, so we're back in the interior. I've got my full quick test done. You can definitely see there's multiple control units that are going to have at least one fault code, if not a few more. Anytime the alternator starts to fail, most of these components are going to register some sort of undervoltage fault. I won't show going through all of these fault codes in every control unit. One thing that I do want to show is an example of this transmission control module right here. We're going to go into this ETC control unit. It says it has one fault code, so let's take a look, see what it is. Now it's saying that there's no fault codes detected, but that's not exactly true, because now we can go to the event memory. An event will be registered in the memory, but it may not necessarily set a fault, so it's a good idea just to check the events, see what's going on. In this case, it's that undervoltage undervoltage to the circuit. So we'll leave that alone for now. Let's go into the MESFI 2.8 motor electronics. So this one we actually have a fault code for the relay for the air pump. So we'll definitely take a look. So I'll go through the rest of these fault codes, see what does and doesn't need to be addressed. Next, we're gonna go ahead and pop the hood, take a look underneath. So the first thing that I did was I went through and I removed the intake tubes and the air filter housings. I've got those over on the bench over here. Taking a look inside, you can see the condition of that air filter. Not terrible, but it's definitely got some miles on it. My guess would be 2 to 3 years worth of use on there. Looking at the other side, looks to be about the same story. Looking at the condition of the belts, both drive belts look to be in good condition. I'm not seeing any cracking on either. I'm not seeing any cracking on either of the belts. One of the other issues that he mentioned is he's getting a little bit of an oil leak. So let's take a look, see if we can figure out what's going on here. I've got a mirror in my hand. Residue, looks like a little bit of oil's leaking out from around that corner. Let's go over here to the back. Same story back here. Taking a look over here on this side. Front looks relatively dry. Let's check the back. Just a little bit on this side. Looks like it's just starting to weep, just starting to seep. So we'll recommend valve cover gaskets, see if he's interested in doing that. Next, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and take a look at our fluids. We'll start by checking the coolant. Looking down in there, nice blue color, a little bit on the low side, but not by too much, maybe an ounce or two. So that looks good. Next, what I'll do is I'll check the brake fluid. And I have a tool here in my hand, and what this is gonna do is it's gonna measure the water content inside of the brake fluid. So you can see up here, I've got 2 LEDs lit up. So it's showing me less than 2% water content. So that's a good sign. Anything 3 to 4% or above, they'll recommend that you change the fluid. We'll go ahead and we'll check the condition of our oil. Luckily, this is still back when Mercedes provided us with dipsticks. Oil looks like the level is correct, nice and clear. All right, so under the hood, a couple of minor issues, nothing too serious. Next thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and get this car up in the air, get a couple of the wheels off, take some brake measurements, and look around underneath. All right, so we're here at the front axle, and I'm gonna go ahead and measure these brake discs. I'm not sure how well this shows up on camera, but there is usually a stamp on these rotors, if they're factory rotors, that show the minimum thickness. This one says 34.0 millimeters for minimum thickness. So now what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna measure with my handy dandy caliper gauge. Make sure we're zeroed. So if you look right here, 32 millimeters. So we're about 2 millimeters below the minimum thickness on this front rotor. There's a pretty good lip on those rotors as well. Let's take a look at the thickness of the brake pads. They're a little on the low side. We'll grab our handy dandy gauge here. So for that side, we're looking at about 6 millimeters. I'd say that since the rotors are already pretty well below the minimum thickness, I'm going to recommend front front brake pads and rotors. I'll talk to the owner, see what he wants to do regarding these brakes. These front discs are definitely worn below their minimum thickness, so they will need to be replaced. I'm gonna recommend doing pads while we're in here. They're about 50% life left, but I'll go ahead and get that recommendation made and get a couple of prices together for a couple of different options and see what the owner wants to do. Now let's check out the rear axle. All right, so back here on the rear axle, it has this dust shield installed, so it makes it a little trickier to try and get my caliper gauges on there. So for this, what I'm gonna do is just remove the 2 bolts that hold this caliper in place. They're 18 millimeters, and I'll be able just to slide the caliper back, hang it up for the time, and go ahead and get my measurements. On this one as well, it is stamped on here. It's a little difficult to see on camera, but it's marked as minimum thickness 24.0 millimeters. So we'll go ahead and get it measured, but before we do that, let's take a quick check at the thickness of these brake pads. So measuring these brake pads inside and out, we're just between 6 and 8 millimeters, so 7 millimeters, so a decent amount of life left on these rear pads, but I'm a little worried about the condition of these rotors, so let's get that caliper off and measure the let's get this caliper off and measure the thickness of the rotor. It's a hard life, isn't it? Alright, so we've got our caliper hung up off to the side. Micrometer zeroed. 24.93. We'll take a couple of different measurements. 24.33. 24.4. So you can see that there's definitely a groove or 2 that is worn into this rear rotor. So I'm going to spin it a little bit. I'm going to take those same measurements from a different spot. So let's measure it from right here. 24.9, 24.2, 24.4. So like I said, the minimum thickness on these rotors is 24 millimeters. We're less than a millimeter depending on where we measure it. In some cases as close as 0.2 millimeters from that minimum thickness. So I'm going to go ahead and recommend that we replace these as well. I'll get a couple of different price options together, see if we want to keep it factory or go with something aftermarket. I wanted to show this process because it's a little bit of extra work pulling off this rear caliper, but it pays off to get those more accurate measurements rather than trying to bend this dust shield out of the way. So next what I'll do is I'll remove the underbody panels and we'll take a look underneath. So there's definitely some residue right here, but looking up further, that upper radiator hose, the clip is installed. It's seated correctly, but it looks like it's leaking from that hose. So we'll definitely be recommending a upper radiator hose replacement. Looking around under here, everything's nice and dry up in this corner. Some of that coolant residue that's been splashing around. Lower radiator hose is nice and dry, no issues on this side. Can look up and we can see our alternator, the back side of the alternator. Everything's connected. Not seeing any problems there, but we will need to replace it. Like I said, we full field tested it and it's not maintaining the battery any more than 12 volts, so that'll definitely need to be replaced. Steering rack boots, nice and dry. Tie rod in boots, control arm boots, all look good. Now these struts have been converted to coil over, so there's no worry about ABC system leaking. Checking the other side. Boots are intact. Tie rod ends are intact. Strut's nice and dry. This one, maybe a little bit of seeping starting from that steering rack boot, but nothing too bad. Taking a look around the oil pan. A little bit of residue. Doesn't look like anything's actively dripping up here. Looking up at the back side of those valve cover gaskets, there is a little bit of residue coming from up there. That could be what's dripping down back here. Let's check this side. Same thing, just a little bit of residue. A little bit of seeping going on, starting to make its way down. Rear main seal looks nice and dry, doesn't appear to be leaking. Transmission pan. Nice and dry all the way around. Check the electrical connector. Electrical connector. Little bit of seeping, but doesn't it look like it's made it to a drip quite yet, so I'd say that's all right for now. Moving to the back of the transmission, you can see the flex disc has a few stress cracks in it. Might be worth going ahead and replacing. Same thing with this transmission mount. You can see there that we're almost all the way collapsed, so that transmission mount is definitely due. Taking a look at the rear flex disc, that one's definitely got a big old stress crack in it, so I'm going to recommend going ahead and doing both flex discs. Rear differential is nice and dry. Rear drive shaft boots, little bit of cracking, but nothing major. Same thing on the inside, a little bit of cracking, nothing major. Looks to be the same story, although there is a bit of grease residue from maybe when it tore previously and had leaked its grease out, but we'll see about doing that side, whether that's something he wants to do right now or leave it alone. I'd say that's something you could keep driving with. Outside, same story. Looks to be in good condition, doesn't look like it needs to be replaced. Some minor cracks, but nothing major. Ball joints, bushings. Looks to be in good condition. Alright, so after going through doing that full inspection, the owners let me know that the alternator is the biggest concern he has right now, so we'll get an estimate together to get that repaired. I'm also going to recommend doing the brake pads and rotors all the way around, maybe a few of these other items as well. We'll see what the owner wants to do. Doing the alternator on this vehicle is no small job. It takes quite a bit of work, so I'll make a separate video showing that repair. But that'll be the end of this one. Thank you all for watching. I do appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one.